Hello, Command229 here, another Topic of the Week video. So I got a topic that was sort of continuing from last week's topic, so I thought I'd do that as, I guess, more or less a part 2. So we're going to be talking about humanizing in Legend of Korra and Avatar The Last Airbender, but specifically focused on the villains. This week's topic was submitted by Tumblr Anon, and their topic is, I saw your video about the humanizing in Avatar The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. Can you talk about the comparison between Avatar The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra's antagonists/villains? I see a lot of fans admire Legend of Korra villains, saying they have more depth and are more human than Avatar The Last Airbender's antagonists/villains, mostly because they have an ideology, which makes them more interesting. While they claim Avatar The Last Airbender has dull antagonists and villains because none of them have an ideology. I have heard this before, and it's one of those stupid things that a lot of stans will say to defend Legend of Korra by saying, oh, it's so much more brilliant, it's poetic cinema, and it's not. Here's the thing. Every single villain in Legend of Korra has some sort of ideology behind them, which is interesting. Conceptually, the idea that you have all of your main villains with a specific ideology that drives them and forms their character, that's interesting. Having Amon reflect like communist revolutions, having Unalak represent basically essentially like a religious extremism with his over-focus on spirituality and his desire to not only have people be more spiritual, but to force people to be more spiritual, whether they like it or not. You have Zahir. In the Red Lotus, they're basically anarchy. Then you have Kuvira, which is outright fascism. Okay, these ideas are interesting. They're fascinating, because if you told me, like just explaining as an idea, all of the villains have a specific ideological focus that drives the season, I would have thought, oh, that's a cool idea. Because genuinely it is. Here's the problem. Bright aren't good enough writers to pull that off. They could barely get even one basic ideology without turning it into a black and white conflict. It's like they set up the book one conflict in a way that's very morally gray, because Amon has a reason to do what he does. The idea that this is a non-bender who somehow learned the ability to take away bending and is using that to fight back against benders. Because when you look in book one, even just the very beginning, you've got the bending triads harassing non-benders, you've got the metal bending police, you've got the all benders council, you've got pro bending, which is you can only be a bender and play that. And then you have jobs like the like that factory job that Mako takes where he's using lightning. This is all stuff that only benders can do, or that only benders are allowed. So they have all this power. So that's interesting. Korra would technically be on the side of the oppressors. So she has to take a step back and realize, wait a minute, am I really the good guy in this situation? Now, of course, Amon is a terrorist, and he may have noble goals, but he has bad ways of accomplishing these goals. So you would think, as any writer worth their salt would think, that you can use this conflict to develop Korra's character and have her become more mature, level-headed, and think things through to the point of, okay, so she finds a way to solve the problem without, by finding a middle ground between both sides. No. And this is one of the biggest problems with Legend of Korra. It's just not a problem that Avatar The Last Airbender has. All of Korra's problems are punched away. That's the thick and thin of it. All of these problems aren't tackled on a philosophical or ideological level. They're tackled in a bad guy, must fight kind of a way. And it's the most base way you can do it. And it's not even like they just set them up as a conflict. It's just a fight in conflict. If you look at some if you look at like a martial arts movie, like a kung fu movie. In fact, let me pull up the Ip Man movies, because those are movies that are designed to set up fights that are cool, more or less. They also tell a story, but like the main draw of it, particularly with the Ip Man movies. I think the fights are some of the best parts of the entire franchise. The stories can be good at times, but it still pales in comparison to the fights. So the movie sets up conflicts to result in fights. And that's basically what it does, particularly when you get to the big final conflicts. And you can say between, like, in Ip Man, when you have that Japanese, what was he, a general or whatever, that Japanese officer, and Ip Man having the fight in the first movie. Or Ip Man having the fight with that boxer in the second movie. Or the other fight with the other Wing Chun practitioner in the third movie. It says, these are fights that are meant to be punched away. That's basically what it amounts to. They're not trying to set up some deep philosophical level to this. It's mainly to result in a fight. The problem is that Legend of Korra tried to take that same approach as those movies do. They set up a fight that's meant to be they set up a fight that's supposed to solve the problems, but they put up the window dressing of this deep philosophical elements. So you have these half-baked, surface-level, completely shallow political ideas going on, and then they don't really do anything with them. I already talked about with Amon, like, I've talked about this before. The concept of Amon is interesting, and if Amon was actually a non-bender, that would have been very interesting if Korra had to fight him and actually do something about the non-bender issues. But she doesn't. In fact, she exposes him as, he ends up exposing himself as a liar, and he's a hypocrite, because he's a bender, and he was tricking non-benders, which you would think would strengthen their views, but then after that, they're just like, alright, well, I guess we're all just going to give up now. And they sweep it under the rug in Book 2. And in Book 2, it's like, here we have this guy who wants people to be more spiritual. Okay, that can lead to an interesting conflict. Because this is something that you would think. They kind of touch on this occasionally, but they never actually dive into it in the show, properly at least. Is this idea between the modernization of the world versus the old guard, the spirituality. So you have modern technology versus the more spiritual aspects. Okay, an interesting conflict. So then you have this villain, Unalak, being a representation of the spiritual aspects. Okay, that's something that like Tenzin represents too, so this can be a very interesting... Nope, he's just a bad guy who wants to destroy the world, I guess? I don't know. Book 2 was really wonky with the motivations of Unalak, because Unalak just changed at some point. Like, he was blatantly evil. Korra fell for everything, and then it's like, but then they just, particularly in the second half, it's just like, let's just throw out any kind of consistent characterization. Oops. And you have Zahir. And the Red Lotus are really bad because, like, I hate them the most out of all of the villains. Like, I hate them more than Unalak, even if Unalak was really stupid, because they really tried to make the Red Lotus appear like, oh, well, yeah, they were there the whole time. Yeah, did you know there was this group that acts as in conflict with the White Lotus that calls themselves the Red Lotus, who try to kill the Avatar? Oh, what do you mean we've never mentioned this ever before? By the way, Lin has a sister! Book 3 is garbage. But it's like, okay, you have this idea of anarchy. And is Korra going to be doing anything to fight against that? No, she punches the problem. Yeah, and the Red Lotus, like, they're all, like, I've always referred to them as, well, I had a really stupid nickname for Zahir, but it's like, I always called them the Scooby Gang just because they're so goofy. Like, each of them are so ridiculous. Like, you have Zahir, who has airbending, and how does he get airbending? Korra left the spirit portals open, so I guess the world just decided we need more airbenders. So let's just completely and totally devalue all of the work that Aang did in rebuilding the air nomad culture with the air acolytes. Nah, let's just throw more airbenders in because we want superheroes. Oh, screw you, Bryke. You just ruin everything. But you had Zahir with airbending. Then you had gender bend of Combustion Man. Then you had the armless waterbending lady, which might have been interesting. But it's just a gimmick. And you got, like, Lava Bending Man. Lava bending. Which is something that should, like, it combines two elements. You got the earth and you got the fire. It should be an Avatar exclusive ability. But no. In fact, Bolin can do it just by trying. Wonderful. Book 3 gives me a headache. But, like, okay, they're just wacky, goofy gimmicks. And they're supposed to be serious villains. They probably got the closest to actually beating Korra. But there's no actual... Like, they overthrow a government, and what do we get out of that? We get Prince Wu in Book 4. Freaking joy. And even then, they still want to just put Wu on the throne instead of actually having, like, I don't know, an elected leader or something. Because we can't let Kuvira, so we need to support nepotism. This is what I say when you have these really stupid attempts at philosophical and ideological stuff. Like, Bright, don't think about this stuff. Because if you're actually tackling these deeper issues, you really do need to think a lot about this and how this is going to affect things. This is also one of the big reasons why the separation of each of the seasons doesn't really work. Because they want everything to have a hard boundaries. Because Book 1 can't really affect Book 2 all that much. Book 2 can't really affect Book 3 all that much, even though it genuinely does. But they ignore the actual consequences. The whole spirits taking over and destroying Republic City? Yeah, just hand wave it away. And then those seasons can't really affect Book 4. So you don't have any build-up of progression. You just have new things thrown in, and at the end it's like, sweep it all away. So these villains aren't even allowed to have any time to develop. And shoot, Kuvira's one of the only two interesting villains, being Kuvira and Amon, in the entirety of the show, because this idea that she was genuinely helping keep order after the death of the Earth Queen, even if she was being a little too iron-fisted about it, well, that's interesting. So, of course, a lot of people are like, please don't just make her Hitler, please don't make her Hitler, please don't make her Hitler. And they just made her into a crazy fascist. Because that's all this really amounts to. She's just a villain. They treat her as just a villain. And that's what they do with all of these villains. It's like you can't have a morally gray conflict and then treat the villain as pure evil. You can't do it. If you want this villain to be morally gray, you can't treat them like this is a black and white issue. Now, I talked a lot about Legend of Korra here. Let's look back at some of the villains in Avatar: The Last Airbender, because that's when you start seeing a lot more interesting characters. Even Zhao. Probably the least interesting character, or least interesting villain at least, in the entirety of the show, I find to be more interesting than every other villain in Legend of Korra. Just because he has an actual character. He's got strengths. He's got flaws. He's got stuff that he did research at the temple or the library. To find information on the moon spirits and stuff. You find out about his time, his relationship with Zhang. You find out about his temper, his pride. Even if he and Prince Zuko are on the same side, the conflicts between them. It's a morally gray issue because technically both of them are bad guys. But they still have this conflict with each other, and Zuko comes out looking a little bit better. And Zhao was pretty much just the starter villain. And his death, at the end, was karma. Was karma for killing the moon spirit. And it was after Koizilla comes up and grabs him. Even Zuko, and this is a great moment with Zuko's character. Zuko offers a hand to help him. And Zhao refuses. Because his pride wouldn't allow him to accept help from Zuko, a banished prince who's been nothing but a screw-up, at least away in his eyes. That makes... It's interesting. It's an interesting death that he might have lived had he just had a little bit less pride. I can actually talk about his character, because he has a character. And then you get to the more interesting characters. You get Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee. Shoot, Mai and Ty Lee aren't even proper villains, which is ultimately why they ended up becoming good guys by the end of the series. Why they betrayed Azula during the Boiling Rock storyline. I mean, they were both pressured into this. Mai joined because, well, she didn't have anything better to do, and Ty Lee was very, very much forced into it. And then you have Azula, this perfectionist, this prodigy, the true heir for the Fire Nation throne, Ozai's favorite child. And she's this perfect, with her special blue flames, because she's just so much better at firebending. And you see, even by the end of the show, that after she starts losing control of things, and especially after Ozai pulls the rug out from under her, when he announces himself as the Phoenix King, she is such a perfectionist and so obsessed with, being in control, that when she started losing control, she lost her mind. And you even see this in her conflict with her brother. I mean, shoot, the whole relationship between Azula and Zuko is so interesting that even when they're on the same side at the beginning of Book 3, there's still this conflict between them. And Azula, she's interesting. She's this cunning. She's like, what, 14 or 15? She's young, but she's cunning and devious because she was raised by Ozai, the absolute monster of the main antagonist, the main antagonist of the show. You could look at their childhoods. Look, you can look into these characters and you can see this, and you can see at least Azula develop over books 1 and 3. Or, no, what am I saying? Books 2 and 3 of Avatar: The Last Airbender. And you can see her rise and fall as a character. You can see Zuko's entire character arc over the 3 seasons, from him being just a villain to a genuine good guy. Even Ozai, who I have said in some cases in some ways could be seen as the most bland villain, because he is meant to be the big final fight. Even he has a little bit of depth given to him when Zuko talks about him and how their family actually were happy at one point. There may have been a time long ago when Ozai might not have been as bad. Now, of course, he was still a dick, of course, but not as bad as he is when you see him in the show, where he's this monstrous, genocidal psychopath. You have the whole thing in his relationship with Ursa, which, even though a lot of that's shrouded in secret, it's like, oh wow, yeah, you have the fact that Ursa killed his dad so that Zuko wouldn't be killed, and then she fled. You have this whole backstory involving the whole Fire Nation royal family. That there is more character building and more backstory for these characters than there is for any... if you take one of these characters, there's more character depth to any of these characters, even Ozai, than there is for all of the villains of Legend of Korra combined. Because any depth that they have is just... It's faux depth. It's fake. It's shallow. And it's trying to present itself as being more deep. The problem is that it comes across like these people don't come across as professional writers. They come across as edgy teenagers who just learned about philosophy. So they start throwing in these basic ideas in their stories and be like, oh yeah, this guy represents the communist revolution, and then they beat him and he's totally dead because he explodes. That's what it feels like. Brighter professional writers who have been doing this for years, you would think that they would have improved a little, working with people like Giancarlo Volpe, Tim Hendricks, Josh Hamilton, Aaron Ahaz. You would think that a little bit of the writing skills would have been imparted onto them. Just a little bit would have rubbed off on them. But apparently not, because they don't ever want to improve. The characters, the villains in Avatar: The Last Airbender are far more human. You can look into them. They have more depth. Ozai, in just a few bits going about his backstory, with what we see of him in the show, of being a cruel monster, but then you have little bits where Zuko talks about him, how they went and saw the the Ember Island players. Can you imagine Ozai going with the family to watch this goofy comedy play? It happened. And that's more depth. There's more humanization for those characters than there are for the villains in Legend of Korra. Because the villains in Legend of Korra don't have any actual depth. Bryke just treated them as villains. And that's all they are. They're villains and they have some sort of gimmick. They throw in a political gimmick, usually some sort of power gimmick. Whether it's Amon's energy bending or psychic blood bending, whatever. I don't know. That was stupid. It should have just been energy bending. Unalaq becoming the Dark Avatar. Zahir with airbending, and then the rest of the Scooby Gang having gimmick powers. Or Kuvira. Kuvira had was really good at earthbending and used a lot of metal bending, so I guess that wasn't... She was probably the least gimmicky, but she still had a political gimmick of she's being she's basically just a fascist. Because what is nuance? Look, when you're writing stories like this and you want to have these villains be deeper, write them deeper then. Allow them to have humanizing moments. Because Bryke, it's almost like Bryke were so scared that anyone would dare sympathize with the villain that they just made them evil. Well, yeah, you can have villains that we sympathize with, and they can still be bad. Azula, I very much sympathized with Azula by the end of Book 3 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, because you could tell that she's got these mommy issues. She genuinely wanted approval from Ursa, but felt like she never got that. And you get a little bits of that, particularly at the beach episode, where she starts talking about how she feels like Ursa saw her as a monster. It's brushed off as a joke, but that comes back later when she starts losing her mind and she literally hallucinates Ursa. That's far more human. There's far more depth to that than any of these other Legend of Korra villains. It's yes, we can still sympathize with her and she can still be the outright bad guy. I mean, shoot, one of the most heartbreaking moments in the series for me, aside from Uncle Iroh leaves from the vine, is after Katara beats Azula and ties her up and chains her up to the grates, and she's just sitting there screaming and just thrashing about pathetically because she can't do anything. It's this powerful prodigy who became the Fire Lord, at least for a little bit, is now reduced to a screaming mess, and it's wow, you feel really bad for her. It makes me want to see her get better. And you can still sympathize with these villains, and it's you can't sympathize with these villains. If Amon genuinely had that backstory where he was attacked by a firebender and it scarred his face, if that was his actual backstory and he became spiritual and learned, found his way into the spirit world, and met Ko the Face Stealer or something like that, and they taught him energy bending. It's if you had something like that can make him sympathetic, yeah, that would have made his conflict with Korra a lot more powerful. But nope, he's just an evil villain, and they just kept doing that over and over. And it makes you not even care about the villains if they're just villains and they're just bad and they're just evil, and then they try to throw in some faux depth. It just doesn't make them interesting. It just makes them more obnoxious, if you ask me. And that's one of the biggest problems with Legend of Korra. People always say that a show is only as good as its antagonist, or a story is only as good as its antagonist. And in some cases, that can be very true. You don't really need a great antagonist, but it sure does help. Because how many times do you see antagonists be some of the most popular characters? So really, it does help. And frankly, Legend of Korra it always missed the mark. It tried to propose itself as being more human, and a lot of stans will try to desperately claim that it's deeper and more nuanced with more moral grays. But frankly, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and as I talked about, was already far more morally gray, even with its villains. Well, I think that's about it for this topic. If you want to submit a topic to me, you can comment below if you're on YouTube. If you're on Tumblr, send me an ask and put topic : then whatever topic you want me to talk about. Just make sure to follow those I'll be posting down below. You can also submit topics to me on the Discord, which will also be linked down below. If you want to watch last week's topic video, you can check that out here. If you want to watch next week's topic video, you can check that out here when I get that done. So if there's anything else that you want to talk about with the Legend of Korra villains compared to Avatar: The Last Airbender, please comment below. And thank you for watching.